Well, welcome. My name is Jodi Hickerson, and I'm here with Barna and David Kinnaman, looking at this new book that they've got together, that they've worked, this first collaborative effort between the two of you all called Churchless. And so we're just going to spend some time discussing what the data in this book and what you guys have learned. So this book, which you've worked on for the first time together, why should we learn about the churchless? Like, why is it important understanding who the churchless are, like as a group of people?
Well, I think I'll jump in first, is that recognizing that these trends have huge impact on the way our churches and faith organizations work. So recognizing that, I mean, this is based on 2 decades of tracking research, so we were able to compare, over time how people's views towards the church have changed. So the unchurched in the early 90s, the unchurched in the early 2000s, and the unchurched today. There's some real massive changes. Like, it is harder to be a church leader. It is harder today, based on this data, to go out and say, invite your friends to church. And so recognizing sort of the huge context in which these trends play out as a church leader is very important to us as researchers, and so trying to inform pastors and church leaders and Christians about that is very important. I think it makes us more wise, more discerning about how we do the work of the ministry today.
And I think certainly one of the things that the data show is that this population of churchless people is growing very rapidly. And obviously that's not the goal of the Christian church, is to see that population grow. So if we want to turn that trend around, we've got to understand what these people are thinking, what they're doing, why they're making these particular choices, what we could do to actually serve them better, to understand them, to love them, to do everything we can to help them get closer to God. I think without that kind of research, you wind up making an educated guess here and there. And when it doesn't work, you retreat in frustration or fear or doubt or whatever, but you're not as bold the next time out of the blocks. I think armed with this kind of information, it's a lot more likely that you'll come up with a strategy that enables you to have positive impact on the lives of such people. So we're hoping that this will be something that shortcuts a lot of the trial and error that ultimately keeps the church from being the church.
And that's awesome. What was surprising in the research? I mean, were there things, I'm sure you had ideas going into researching this, what churchless, population, what it was like, but were you surprised? Did you have, 2 or 3 things that jumped out that you weren't expecting?
I think it's harder to measure the unchurched because there's more sort of flavors of the unchurched, so they're more resistant to church. There's sort of the atheists and agnostics among the unchurched. They're very, very resistant to churches. There's sort of the born again unchurched. These are people that are still very committed to Jesus, but they're sort of post-church, post-congregational. There are young millennials now who are very sort of resistant, very skeptical of today's churches. They're telling us, like, when I used to be a churchgoer, I realized that the youth pastor was paid to be my friend. So they're very skeptical even of some of the things that we do in our best efforts to reach young people or reach the next generation. So just recognizing sort of like the unchurched aren't just sort of this monolithic community of people that just don't like going to church. There's a lot of reasons, and each of these different sort of tribes are very important for us to recognize. And so that was one of the surprises. Another was just how totally resistant this group of people are to today's churches. They just don't have the same sort of muscle memory of going to church. So 20 years ago, 1 in 7 people had never been to a church at all. Like, so they had no experience at any time in their lifetime, and now it's 1 in every 5 people. So big changes in terms of even that, sort of like their resistance to church.
And I think related to that, one of the things that really shocked me, having tracked this for 30 years, is seeing how little younger Americans, well, all churchless, but particularly the younger churchless Americans, how little they know about Christian history, how little they know about what the church in America has added in terms of value to our society. One of the questions that we had asked them was, what do you think is the positive value that churches have added to America? And there's a lot of silence on the other end of the phone. They couldn't think of anything positive that the church stood for. And then you think about, all right, what we're asking them to do is to change their behavioral patterns so that this group of people, this institution, this set of practices becomes normative in their life. Why would they do that? They have no sense that it produces anything of real value in the world. You know, they want to make a difference with their life. They want their time to matter. They want to be remembered for something useful. Okay, but in their minds, the church isn't part of that. So it was really interesting to see how much of a separation there has come between people under 40 in particular and the church itself.
But not so much a separation between like spirituality, like, you know, churchless has kind of become a cultural norm, but, you know, spirituality has also become a cultural norm. So, you know, what kind of things have you found, and is that a trend that you've seen, or why do you think that kind of persists, like being spiritual but not necessarily religious?
Yeah, my take might be a little bit different than David's on this.
Well, this is good.
I
good
think the media
then.
are selling us a load of crap on this. I think that what's going on is that people aren't necessarily spiritual in the sense that a Christian would think of spirituality. Now, if by spiritual you mean that I'm a human being and I have an essence, and you know there's all this to me that's hard to put your arms around, and that's the spirituality of my life, and what I feel changes from. I mean, there's a lot of airy-fairy stuff that gets counted as spirituality. I mean, that's mindless spirituality to me. I don't particularly pay attention to that and classify that as spirituality. So to me, when I hear and see in the research millions and millions of people, increasing numbers of people saying, oh, well, I'm spiritual but not religious, to me that's a way of saying I'm lazy. I haven't chosen to think about this. I'm not investing my time, my energy, or any of my other resources into this. I'm just real busy trying to be happy and trying to get what I think I'm entitled to. And so, yeah, I'm just spiritual in my own way. I don't think it amounts to a hill of beans.
No, I don't disagree with that. I think a lot of it is this sort of post-institutional sort of world too. So people can do banking without going to a bank, or buy music without going to a music store. They can listen to a podcast of a great sermon and not go to a church. And so there is a sense in which, you know, everything is becoming very modular. You can kind of, you know, do a lot of different things very quickly, and you feel like you're, you know, participating in some sort of spiritual activity. But I agree with George that a lot of this is really sort of cheap grace, is sort of a costless form of faith that a lot of Americans have embraced. And
a mindless form of faith.
Yeah.
I mean, there's nothing behind it.
Right, yeah, and which is always crazy with our research, when you ask people, even among atheists and agnostics, many of them say they pray, right? And many born-again Christians have no idea about very basic orthodoxy. You know, I mean, they're like what the 3 in John 3:16 means. So, you know, you find across really almost every population segment so little reflection and consideration of a lot of these things. So, you know, spiritual but not religious is a cool label, I think, that a lot of people have attached to American spirituality, but it doesn't necessarily, you know, reflect the practices, how faith ought to be at the center of life, not just one of many different modules of their life.
So that's, you know, a trend, but you talk a lot in the book about different trends, cultural shifts, you know. Why is understanding some of those, the cultural shifts and the trends that you're seeing and that you've researched, why is understanding that, you know, key to being able to reach out and to know the churchless and to...
Well, I think, you know, if you're a business leader, Peter Drucker does this thing. He says that the first question a business leader ought to ask is, who's your customer and what do they consider value? Great business leaders will think both in terms of individual customers, like this person who came into my store and what do they need, and they'll also think about sort of the larger shape of, you know, trends in the consumer population. I think we have to be very careful not to use business principles in the church, but there is some truth in this notion that a good leader understands individuals, and he or she understands the larger trends in which those individuals live. And so I think pastors and church leaders and organizational leaders ought to take a look at this research, because yes, you should be driven by those one-on-one interactions about how it is that we can improve our church, how it is we can improve our experience for a donor or for someone who's interested in what it is that we're doing in the world. But you also have to look at these larger trends because things are changing. This research actually showed us just how much more resistant the unchurched have become to being offered anything from a church, being invited by a friend, receiving a mailing from a church. We're absolutely inundated with marketing requests of all types. And so the church ends up competing in that space, like let's just market our church. And so how it is that we can actually move authentically to reach these people individually, one-on-one, life to life.
Yeah, I think what this does is it gives you the context within which we're trying to reach them. You can't motivate or mobilize people to do something apart from that context. So if you don't understand the context, the chances of you doing anything that will cause the kind of action that you're hoping to cause is pretty slim.
Wow. So you have been studying faith trends, cultural shifts, the church, in America for 30 years. Have you, like with this research and seeing where these trends and shifts are heading, have you ever had something that you've been tracking, a trend you've been tracking? Have you ever seen it reverse? Have you ever seen something that you've been tracking?
People's perspectives on things do change sometimes as a result of what they're exposed to or what seems to be more popular or in fashion at a given time. You think about people's socio-political ideology. Are you primarily a liberal, a conservative, or somewhere in between? I mean, that shifts back and forth. There's like a pendulum swing that happens. Historians talk about every 30 years the pendulum swings, to one end, and then 30 years later it's swung back to the other end. And I think that's changing now because society's speeding up. It's no longer 30 years, but you do see some things go back and forth. Abortion is another example where there are points in time where you find most people are against all forms of abortion, that it swings. Everybody says no, it's every woman's right to do whatever she wants. It goes back and forth. Why? Because we don't have a worldview that's stable, that helps us to always come to the same conclusion based on a sense of what truth is. So do things change? Can things change? Yes. But by and large, once a major shift has taken place in public opinion, say something like same-sex marriage, are we likely to go back to a place where people are going to say, no, it's only a man and a woman? Not in our lifetime. If that happens, it's going to be a long time before that happens. That's again why I think this context, seeing what's happening, what direction things are moving in, how quickly they're moving, what's causing them to move, all of that is critical for us as church leaders to understand so that when we're interacting with people, we get their motivations. We can speak to what's really troubling them or moving them or motivating them to do things or say things or believe things.
So, sometimes we feel like the trends or whatever, the shifts are inevitable. We're resigning ourselves that this is the way it's going to be. But in releasing something like this, it's about being informed. And why does understanding, kind of still help? Or we not just resigned to this shift of more and more churchless people?
Well, I love the idea of being an information purveyor. I mean, being an information company, being a researcher. It's like my business. I love it. I would ask that people be informed, but also learn how to be faithful with that information. So I think sometimes we have the wrong metric of success, which is like, taking over culture or reestablishing some sort of Christian, value in the world. Like that's great, right? But the most important thing that Jesus asks us to be is to be faithful in wherever we are, and to be faithful with the choices and relationships that we have. Or as a pastor, I know you and Mike, are planting a church, and so what is it that it means to be faithful here in Ventura, California, and so how do you help people in our faith community be faithful, right? That's a very important sort of question. And so I think good information, like more than just being like informed about the statistics, it helps us to learn how to be faithful. So one of the examples I often go to is Daniel in Babylon. There was a certain set of choices he had to make to be faithful in that context. They were very different than if he were still in Jerusalem, right? So there's a context that we have to play our faith out in, and faithfulness is how God measures our faithfulness. And so recognizing that this kind of information actually helps us to do that as Christians. It's not just, wow, I know more facts now. It's instead, wow, I can actually have a more intelligent conversation. I can be more faithful to the things that God is calling us to do with my unchurched neighbors and friends and coworkers.
That's awesome. So with this research, are there obstacles that were really, kind of glaring, like 2 or 3 obstacles that kind of popped up that, you would say every church leader needs to know about these 2 or 3 obstacles as it pertains to reaching the churchless in America right now?
I think there were 2 that really jumped out at me. One is that when churchless people are reflecting on matters of faith and thinking about a church, one of the things they're trying to figure out is, well, if you're a church person, I'm a churchless person, what's the difference? What impact has it made on your life so that I can see, is there sufficient benefit that I should actually rearrange the way that I think and behave in order to become churched? And what we found is that by and large, there's almost no discernible difference in the lifestyles between churched people and churchless people. So when a churchless individual is looking at folks that go to churches, they're thinking, well, that's good. There must be some kind of religious fix that they're getting met, which doesn't really produce any visible changes in who they are, but maybe it makes them feel better. Good for them. But I don't need that. I don't see that it's worth the effort. So that living out what allegedly we say we believe and what we're taught in a church community is absolutely critical toward diminishing the numbers of churchless people we have in America. The other thing that jumped out at me was that when churchless people visit a Christian community, particularly in a typical church service, the one thing that they're looking for isn't the hottest guitarist in town. It's not the best speaker being behind the microphone. It's not the greatest light show. What they're looking for is something that they can't get elsewhere. And the number one thing that they said they felt that they really were hoping to experience but didn't when they visited was the presence of God. I don't think the churchless are unique in looking for that. I think church people are coming here for that as well. And the fact that they're willing to settle for experiences or adventures where God may not seem to be present in any way that they can discern is a sad reality. But to have these tens of millions of individuals who, if we're graced with their presence, whether it's in a small group or an event or just a relationship of people at lunchtime who are representing the church or coming to a church service, the one thing that ought to be noticeably different about believers when they're together is that God is there among them. That somebody else can sense something different, and that difference is the presence of God. Because without that, why should they come? So I think those are 2 things that, if I were going to get back in the pastorate and say, all right, look, with my church, what have I got to do? There's all the programmatic stuff, which frankly doesn't amount to a hill of beans in most cases. And I mean, we could have a whole other discussion another day about who are we doing this for? And, we tend to think about adults. I mean, really, where all of these kinds of ideas about not going to church, not believing in God, not being part of a faith community, all of that, that's in place by the age of 13. So if we want to really see somebody's life radically transformed, we got to get there when they're young. We can't wait till they're 30 and now they have kids and we think, oh good, they have kids, so we'll suck them back in. Wrong approach. But I mean, we've got to really rethink this whole idea of what are we doing? Can we expose them to the presence of God? And can God's presence change me so much that when an outsider is watching me, they say, wow, there is something different. There is something he or she has that I want. I got to explore that a little more.
Yeah, I was so surprised by that infographic of the lack of difference between the church and the churchless. That was pretty amazing. Any obstacles or other observations you would have for You see,
yeah, well, to jump on one thing that you all are talking about here as a positive thing too, I've got plenty of obstacles which I'll mention, but one of the cool things to jump off what you're saying is that in this research and the research behind Unchristian, we saw that so often the one thing that actually changes people's perception of the church and actually want to be involved in the church is seeing transformation in somebody else's life, right? Or seeing somebody who actually did something different that was, countercultural, right? They, instead of being angry, they forgave, right? Instead of instead of spending all the money on themselves, they gave, sacrificially to someone else. We just did a big study on millennials and the Bible, and one of the things that increases people's Bible reading is seeing somebody else who's reading the Bible who that changed their life, right? So we're all looking for, the weight loss plan, the parenting thing, some solution to our lives. It turns out that God is at the center of all that, in the end. And so when people are finding their way to God or to the church, I think we end up sort of this bait and switch where it's like, well, if you just come here, we'll like talk you into the logical aspects of why being a Christian makes sense. There's nothing wrong with that, but in the end, people are looking for changed lives, and God is in the business of changing lives. So we're, this is the right place for us to be trying to help make a difference.
Yeah, that's awesome. And that's something so powerful about that. I mean, that's what I've witnessed so much with people, that have had radical life transformation. It's like they're the ones that can't shut up about it, and that's what's so awesome. That's where you see the evangelism, discipleship, whatever, smash them together. That's where you see that happening, is through people's lives being transformed that are giving it away.
Yeah, people get so curious, like, what happened for you? Tell me more. Yeah.
Like, you're not who you used to be. And I know you've done a ton of work on the topic of transformation. So does that kind of blend here with this study and this new research with the Churchless?
It does, and I think it even bounces off what we're talking about here. I mean, in that project that we did that came out in the book Maximum Faith, when we look at transformation and what keeps people from being the person that God ultimately wants them to be, really the hardest obstacle for most people to get over is their willingness to allow God to break them of sin, self, and society. And so when you look at churchless people, as they're looking at those of us who are Christians, recognizing that most Christians have not allowed God to break them. They're still trying to do it all on their own, still trying to be strong and forceful and do it their way, etc. That's killing us. We're not willing to give it up. We're not willing to sacrifice, to surrender, to submit, to do all the things that enable God to be number one in our lives and for us to follow Him. As Jesus told us to do, follow me, follow me. Simplest instruction, hardest thing in the world for us to do. And so that was an interesting thing here, reading the ideas and the perceptions of churchless people and putting it in the context of what do we know about church people. And there's still so much pride and selfishness in all of us that we're missing the opportunity to impact the lives of those around us because we won't let God be God.
And that was one of the surprises to me in the research, sort of this blurring line between the churchless and the churchless and the churched, and that a lot of the people that attend a great church, they're coming fewer weekends per month. So even the notion of like this sort of very discrete, like the churchless people never attend in a typical 6-month period. Traditionally, that's the way Barna Group has defined it. You don't go to a church in 6 months or more for at least the last 6 months. But what we're seeing is that even those that are, pretty actively church are defining that just because they showed up once every 6 weeks, right? And so even, you and your husband are, planting a church, and like the idea of trying to influence the churched, like there are more churchless people in our churches because we don't have as much surface area, as much time with them to try to undo all the stuff that culture is putting into them. So that was also a surprise to me, is this notion that even though we have a growing number of unchurched people, a lot of families are busy with soccer practice and games and all sorts of other things that they do on a typical weekend, which is fine in its own way, but like they're beginning to sort of like lose even the traction that you would have with a typical family. And so this is part of the reason why the church is struggling to transform even the people who are regular parts of it, right? Because so much of our identity is being defined as parents, it's being defined as consumers, it's being defined based on our camping activities and our kids' sports. And instead of necessarily being, we're part of a Christian community, we're trying to grow, and there's a certain discipline in, being active in that. And sure, there's freedom if you miss a weekend, but how is it that over time, as a pastor, you can create a logical sort of like in a 6-part series, right, or an 8-part series, and they miss half of that at least? How do you disciple in that context? That's part of the new challenge of discipling and transforming people's lives in this digital, distractive, you can barely keep people's attention in our environment today. So how is it that we can actually do good transformation work among the churched, let alone reach the unchurched? I mean, that was one of this glaring question that came up as we worked on this book.
Do you have an answer? Yeah.
Well, I mean, there's no simple solution to it, but I mean, part of it is, I've been thinking about, I love design and infographic design as a researcher. One of the things that struck me is if you're going to do a multi-part sermon, maybe having like an infographic, a picture of each of those 6 series, it's, those 6 topics that you're gonna talk on, so that you're helping people say, okay, you missed a piece. Like the puzzle isn't complete until you've actually sort of filled in something. And maybe instead of listening to the full 30-minute sermon, maybe there's a 10-minute version of that, right? So you do, the 30, 40-minute sermon, but you also give people the chance of consuming a portion of that through a smaller web video. But helping people see, like, this is the journey we asked you to take with this information. George, you worked on this book, Think Like Jesus. And like most people don't have a coherent biblical worldview, and part of it is because we haven't actually given them like a map, like a puzzle top to say this is what it ought to look like. And so you're coming each weekend and you get a good sermon and it's like, wow, high five, let's go out and change the world. But there were 10 other sermons that kind of helped you understand the context for that, right? And so is there a way, as great communicators and using digital social media, using web videos, using infographics, using design, to tell a story of what it is we're trying to help people, capture? Is there a chance of using, the youth group to do a video on each of those 6 topics, where they try to tell the same story, and you play the 2-minute, their 2-minute video to go along with the pastor's sermon, right? So there's all sorts of creative ways that we can enlist other people within our congregation, right? Designers and youth groups and others to sort of like, let's capture this content together. Let's see what Scripture says to us about this topic. But I'm noticing that in my own life, right? As a parent of 3 kids, 15, 13, and 10, like it's hard to stay, up to speed even with what we're very active in trying to be a part of a church, but it's hard to stay up to speed with all the things that we're trying to learn. And so I think we need new tools for that, both again to disciple the church, but also to reach the unchurched.
Wow, so that's awesome. The creativity, like even just thinking what you said before, like being informed but being faithful with the information, is asking those questions like what do we do with this? How do we do this? How do we reach these people? So
it's tougher than ever. I mean, that's part of what 20 years ago when I started, 30 years ago plus when you started doing this research, like it's not like it was easy to be Christian at that time, but it is harder than ever to be a pastor, to be a Christian leader, to be a Christian family. And acknowledging that doesn't make it any easier, but at least we can sort of say, okay, well, what does God have for us today?
So, just as someone who is in church leadership, I have planted a church. I mean, we showed up here to reach people that weren't currently going to church anywhere. And I've heard some things as far as like the dependence on God and not doing it on our own, and being faithful. And what are some other like kind of encouragement that you would give to church leaders to say these are a couple of things that we got to do if we're going to get after reaching this group of people, this people group, Churchless in America?
Well, one of the things that struck me was that when you think about the progression of what does it take to get a person to move from being churchless to churched, being part of a community of faith, a lot of it has to do with thinking outside of the boundaries of, I've got to get them from their living room into the worship service. That's not going to happen. There are a number of other things that are going to happen before they circle around and then come to a worship service. If they do, they may become part of the church and never be part of that worship service. Now, some church leaders are aghast at that notion. Say, well, get over it. I mean, this is where we're at. We don't have to like it. We just have to deal with it. And so recognizing how people's lives move in this culture is a critical aspect. So, I mean, what's working? Number one, there's got to be some kind of relationship. Now, it used to be 20 years ago, when I wrote similar books about the unchurched back then, the idea was, oh, go out, make some friends and talk to them about Jesus. And eventually you'll have the opportunity to share the gospel, and they'll be so excited, they'll say, what do I do next? And you'll say, hey, why don't you come with me Sunday morning, and we'll worship this God together. It's like, yeah, I want to do that. Now it's like, really? That's all you got? So it's a completely different thing. Yes, you need to have the relationship, but the goal isn't then to bring them to the church service Sunday morning, because even offering that is probably going to hinder the relationship itself. So you've got to be thinking more along the lines of, how do I embody Christ? How do I introduce a person to the principles of Scripture, maybe even without them having or reading or looking into a Bible? Wanting them to get there, yes, but that may not be the next step. There's going to be a lot of background work that has to take place first. So the relationship, and the other thing is events. We are an event-driven society. People want experiences, particularly younger adults. And so we've got to give them not churchy experiences that they think add value or meaning or purpose to their life, where they're in the presence of people who are Christ followers. And they're comfortable being in the presence of Christ followers. And they want to spend more time with those Christ followers. And over the course of time, they notice that those Christ followers do some things differently. And then those conversations start. Why do you do that? I mean, I've never done that. I don't do it that way. What's your deal? And then being able to talk about that without saying, well, I'm a Christian, so I'm doing it right. But I mean, just leading them down a path, slowly recognizing that we're essentially in the dark ages in America today. We've got to start with the assumption that these people know nothing, and if they know anything about Christianity, it may not be positive. And so we've got to take a whole different approach to what it means to bring somebody into God's presence.
And I think people are anxious for real answers to questions like, they're so dependent on their screens now, and it turns out that the idea of Sabbath is actually a commandment for us, and that Christians, maybe this gets into some of the stuff we've been talking about, that Christians are virtually no different than non-Christians in most of their behaviors and lifestyles. So we're just as addicted to our screens. We wake up with our screens. We go to sleep with our screens. In the middle of the night, we're interrupted by checking Facebook on our phones. And so the way of being Christian, for instance, could be if we had a deeper theology of Sabbath and we talked about what it means to pause and to have a day a week without screens. And may work for some people, it may work for not for others, but the principle, what does it mean to be Christian and in a digital world is the question that we could ask. And if we could prepare our kids and our young people and those of us who are adults, right, like to have a different rhythm with our screens, that is a way of saying we could actually live a differently than the world. So people say, man, why is it that you're not addicted to your screens? Why is it that when I see you guys eating in a restaurant, you're not all checking your phones, right? And so these are all kinds of things that there's a public way we can live our faith. That truthfully, from the data, it just doesn't happen that often, where a Christian community actually looks differently on these different things, right? So that's a huge challenge for us as church leaders, but to sort of say, okay, well, what would it look like to organize our lives around a very different sort of ethic, to be a counterculture, to say, this is the way we live now. There's a pastor in LA, Tim Chaddock, with Reality LA, who's talking about the concept of chastity with his church. And he's saying, we actually think that term, it's an old-fashioned term that reminds everybody of chastity belts, but we're reframing that. We're bringing a new idea of what it means to be chaste and why that's actually a very important concept. And so I think sometimes we're afraid of Sabbath or chastity or pilgrimage and these old concepts, but it turns out that young people especially are actually very interested in those things. This actually helps me to live a more God-honoring life. And so that's one of the things that we're seeing in this research as well, that people actually want deeper answers, not simple answers.
Something distinctive, something that's different, yeah. So just curious, like, have you seen things that are places or leaders or just where it's working, where was there any hope in this research to go like, oh, they're getting it right, or I mean, just or just events or experiences or things that you've seen that you thought was hopeful?
Well, there's thousands of churches that are doing good jobs, and they're working hard at this, and so it's tough because it feels like our culture literally steamrolls faithfulness, and it's so hard to be faithful in this new context. But I mean, one of the longstanding principles of Barna Group is that we don't identify like here is the church, because in the past, as we've done that, people say, okay, well, let's just go figure out.
Let's just copy what
Yeah,
they're doing.
exactly.
Yeah, work for them.
So yes, absolutely. There are plenty of places that are doing good kingdom work, so notice those things in your church community, in your organization. Do more of it, right? Like each of the churches that are represented in the study here, each of the churches that might be watching this video, would be doing good things. So like acknowledge that, find it, do it more. But it's often what we see is that it's so hard because there's so many of these like policies and programs and practices that end up getting more attention in our churches, but they aren't actually transforming people's lives, but it's too tough to break that up, right? We'd rather just keep it going to keep everybody happy. And so, but that's probably not as kingdom-oriented work, right? So finding a way to actually break up the party when it comes to just the sort of the social club of Christianity and do more of the kingdom work is what we would encourage leaders to do.
That's awesome. I mean, inviting people into the party, that's what we're about, and the transformation and it being real. Just really appreciate your work and the study and the research and the information that we get to be faithful with and have conversations around. So appreciate this, and this is Churchless, and you guys, your collaborative work, and really grateful for that. Thanks.
Thanks, Jodi.
Thank you.
Thank you.